just a quick overview then of the project to restore and run the Sunbeam 1000 horsepower. The plan is over the next 2 years to get the car back into running condition before returning to Daytona for the 29th of March 2027 to mark the centenary of the car breaking the 200-mile-an-hour barrier and setting a new land speed record. Sounds quite simple, as you're going to hear later this evening, or throughout this evening. Not quite as simple as it might sound, and also Daytona Beach has changed a little bit in 100 years as well. So any idea that people seem to be bandying about that we're running the car at 200 miles an hour, I think you'll see from that isn't what the intention is. It is a shame. It'll be a demonstration run, but we think that it'll be a spectacle even at a lower speed. It's also a turtle sanctuary these days, so it's not quite so easy to just run cars up and down the beach. We've been working actually with the team at the Motorsports Hall of Fame, who are very well connected with the authorities at Daytona Beach, and are working with them on the permissions, and we've got their backing and their blessing. So now we've just got to raise the money to do all of this. And that is one of the central things I would want to stress this evening. It is a fundraising event this evening. I hope you'll have the opportunity to look at some merchandise and hopefully purchase some and make a donation, because all that's very important if we're going to reach the target. We've already about a quarter of a way there in terms of the money we need to raise. We've also had some significant support in kind from a range of donors and supporters, some of whom are here tonight, Brooks Speed and Castrol, and we thank you for your generosity. But it's absolutely vital that if everybody who feels as passionate about this project as we do, I hope you'll get involved, and I hope you'll feel able to make a donation. What we're going to do next is run the short film Scarf and Goggles. Sound, Martin?
You can stand up and narrate it, can you?
Sorry, I couldn't work out what the hand signals were. Is it the sound on here? Martin, can you drive your laptop?
Sorry, people.
What are you doing with the mouse? Sorry? Carl, well, while we sort out the film, do you want to come say a few words about what inspired you to make it?
Good evening. When I was 10, I came to this museum and I saw the Sunbeam 1000 horsepower, and I was inspired to pursue a lifelong interest in land speed record breaking. I had an annual that had been printed in the 1960s that I got in a jumble sale with the tales of Donald and Malcolm Campbell in it, and the headline, he wanted an engine that was still on the secret list, and I was absolutely hooked. So the story of Seagrave and this iconic car so eye-catching in its red colour, so extraordinary with two engines in it, as you'll see, I felt I had to tell the story. So I made a story, I put it on YouTube, and it seems to have garnered a lot of interest, so I do hope you enjoy it.
Get rid of that. Hold on.
1926. At the Sunbeam Motor Car Company in Wolverhampton, England, they were building a monster. The building shook each time it was started up. There was nowhere in Britain big enough to run it. Driver Henry Seagrave wasn't convinced he'd be able to control it. In the race to set the first 200 miles per hour speed record, Sunbeam were building a 1,000 horsepower car out of spare parts. The men who built it called it the Slug. In the US, they had a better name for it. They called it Mystery. The Sunbeam Motor Car Company was formed in 1905, born out of Englishman John Marston's successful bicycle business. French engineering genius Louis Cotelon joined the company as chief engineer in 1909, and the company was soon turning out innovative designs that saw success both on and off the track. With the advent of the First World War, Sunbeam also became a prolific manufacturer of aircraft engines, and by the end of the war, Cotelon had risen to be the company's joint managing director. Brooklands racer Henry Seagrave had set his first land speed record in 1926, at the wheel of a Sunbeam, only to see it broken just over a month later by John Parry Thomas driving Babs, an ex-Brooklands car now sporting a 27-litre Liberty Aero engine. Seagrave and Cotelon could see that whilst record-breaking could continue to bring valuable publicity to Sunbeam, future challenges would require a radical new approach. Sunbeam shareholders weren't so sure, and with minimal funds approved, Cotelon's only option was to build the new car from the company's parts bin. Sunbeam's chief engineer Jack Irving designed the new car, and construction began at Sunbeam's Moorfield Works in Wolverhampton in late 1926. In the corner of the workshop lay a pair of Sunbeam Matabele V12 aircraft engines, salvaged from a sunken powerboat. At 22.4 litres, each engine produced around 450 horsepower. Combining the two engines in one relatively crude steel chassis would provide 900 horsepower, although the car would be publicised as the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam. The engines were too bulky to use side by side, and so Irving placed one ahead of the driver and one behind. The cockpit was offset to avoid the prop shaft that coupled the engines together, allowing Seagrave to sit low down within a sleek body that was tested in Vickers Wind Tunnel at Brooklands. As work continued on the car, Sunbeam's engineers began referring to it as the Slug. Irving's design featured a tubular frame onto which was mounted a slab-sided body with front and rear curves designed according to the latest aerodynamic thinking. Irving had managed to keep the frontal area of the car as low as possible, and a figure of 18.7 square feet resulted in a drag coefficient of 0.34, fairly slippery even by today's standards, but revolutionary in 1926. The huge Matabele engines were cooled by 3 radiators, one in the nose for the front engine and 2 in the sides for the rear. Exhaust for the front motor exited through the body sides, with louvers in the top to help heat escape. 12 exhaust stubs behind the driver serviced the rear engine. When the car was run up on a test stand in the workshop, as the building shook, the noise from the 24 cylinders was described as shattering. Seagrave, watching the test, said afterwards, "It is the only time I can honestly say when I have stood in front of a car and doubted human ability to control it." Although Sunbeam had been using shaft drive in all its racing cars since 1910, Irving was concerned at the prospect of running 900 horsepower through a conventional rear axle, and so a 3-speed gearbox would turn the rear wheels using drive chains. Thick steel was used around the rear wheels to contain a flailing chain if it broke free. On the test stand, with the wheels spinning under power, The chains could be seen glowing red hot. The Slug would run on conventional, if large, wire wheels of 35 by 6 inches. Dunlop provided specially made tyres, which it tested and guaranteed for 3.5 minutes use at 200 miles per hour, with wheels and tyres to be changed after each run. The rear wheels and drive chains would be covered by spats, wheel covers designed to reduce drag. When complete, the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam stood 23.5 feet long and 6 feet wide, and weighed around 4 tons. Top speeds in each gear were predicted to be 74, 139 and 212 miles per hour, with the engines using a gallon of fuel per minute. The car was rolled out of the workshop on the 21st of February 1927, days after Malcolm Campbell had raised the record to 174.88 miles per hour in his new Bluebird. Seagrave gave the Sunbeam the briefest of test runs on the factory's roads. In fact, it ran for just 300 yards before it was carefully packed in a huge wooden crate ready for Daytona. With Seagrave aiming at 200 miles per hour, it was felt that recent British sites for speed records, Pendine Sands in Wales and Southport Beach in northwest England, would not offer enough room to run a car that would need 4.5 miles to accelerate, a measured mile for the record, and a further 4.5 miles to stop. Although the 20-mile beach at Daytona looked ideal, running the car in the US meant that British sponsors were reluctant to back the record attempt, and Seagrave ended up paying for much of the trip to the US himself. Seagrave sailed to America on Cunard's flagship, Berengaria, with representatives from KLG and Dunlop, an 8-ton crate containing the car, a further 18 crates of spares, 3 crates of tyres, and 8 mechanics. Sunbeam also sent a 3-litre 1926 show car to help publicise the brand. During the crossing, Seagrave learned of the fatal accident suffered by his friend John Parry Thomas at Pendine, whilst trying to better Campbell's record. Like the Sunbeam, Babs was chain-driven, and at the time it was thought that a broken chain had caused the accident and decapitated Parry Thomas. Sobered by the news, Seagrave's team vowed to pay careful attention to the Sunbeam's drive chains. No one was in any doubt that the forthcoming record attempt was a dangerous endeavour. Seagrave was warmly welcomed at Daytona. This was, after all, the first of the famous British speed kings to attempt a record in the US. He'd managed to secure a working arrangement between the AAA, who would time the event, and the AIACR, the forerunner of the FIA, who then, as now, would ratify the world land speed record. Despite the lack of testing before sailing for America, Seagrave's team made very few changes to the car in Daytona. After just 2 trial runs on the beach, alterations were made to the steering gear, and newly lined brake shoes were needed after the original aluminium shoes melted. When Seagrave's helmet was almost torn from his head by buffeting at speed, a deflector was added to the cockpit. Although the streamlined spats over the rear wheels were thought to add 5 miles per hour to the car's top speed, it was decided that easy access to check the drive chains and avoid the risk of entanglement if a tyre burst were more important factors, and so the car would run without them. Once further issues with the gear selectors and engine cooling had been sorted, the car and the team were ready for the record attempt. On March the 29th, 1927, huge crowds gathered on Daytona Beach to watch Seagrave and the car America had christened Mystery, the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam. Compressed air bottles started the rear engine before it was used to turn over and start the front motor. In the first of the car's 3 gears, Seagrave moved off gently towards the start line, where he accelerated hard towards 200 miles per hour. In windy conditions, only Seagrave's skill saved him when the car skidded for 400 yards and hit several marker flags before he lifted the throttle as he left the measured mile. As it neared the end of the beach, the Sunbeam's brakes failed to slow the car, and quick thinking by the ex-Brooklands racer saw Seagrave head for the shallow water, running the car through the surf until it was back under control. As he came to a halt on the beach, Seagrave could sense the record was close. The wheels and brakes were changed, the drive chains were checked, and the Sunbeam roared off back down the beach, well within the mandated 1 hour time limit. This time, a tailwind ensured the run was even faster, at 207 miles per hour. As Seagrave rolled to a stop and people crowded round him on the beach, the news spread quickly. A two-way average of 203.792 miles per hour through the mile. Seagrave and the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam, built out of spare parts for next to nothing, had smashed Campbell's existing record, raising it by almost 30 miles per hour. Campbell would come to Daytona himself the following year and take the record back, but for now, Henry Seagrave was the fastest man alive and the first to 200 miles per hour. In the end, Seagrave had made it look easy at Daytona. With just a handful of runs up and down the beach, he had raised the world land speed record by the biggest margin in history. For the next 8 years, British and American speed kings would regularly duel for land speed honours at Daytona, before the salt flats at Bonneville eventually beckoned. The Great Red Car provided a huge amount of publicity for Sunbeam. It made a triumphant appearance at Brooklands in June 1927, touring the famous circuit powered by the rear engine alone, before it was transported to London and put on display at famed department store Selfridges, where thousands of people took the opportunity to view the fastest car in the world for themselves. Having covered just 75 miles under its own power, it is now on display alongside other famous land speed cars at the National Motor Museum, Beaulieu, in the south of England. Henry Seagrave returned to Daytona in 1929 with what some consider the most beautiful land speed car of them all, Golden Arrow. For more about that car, check out the Scarf and Goggles channel, where you'll find the full story. Knighted by the King for his record-breaking achievements, Sir Henry Seagrave was killed making an attempt on the world water speed record in June 1930. Shortly after his death, the Seagrave Trophy was established to recognise outstanding British achievements on land, water or in the air.
Hello, good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Doug Hill. I'm an alcohol... Oh no, wrong Saturday night. Yes, Doug Hill, Manager and Chief Engineer, National Motor Museum Beaulieu, and I would like to say a thank you to Edward Lord Montague of Beaulieu, Lord Montague's father, because we wouldn't be here today, we wouldn't be celebrating this car if it wasn't for his vision. And there's one of his cars, is the 350 horsepower Sunbeam. There's one we prepared earlier. Stan, the mastermind of getting that wonderful little engine, 18.3 litre V12, and some of you I know have seen it running, and starts on the handle. The thing that starts the Sunbeam is that over there, Michael. Yeah, that's the winder of the starting handle. And of course, we're here to talk about the Slug, the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam. That car would not be at Beaulieu if Edward Lord Montague had not decided to purchase the car. And there is a tale behind that. And you're not my old boss, you're still my boss, Ken. Ken Robinson, the managing director at the time, was tasked by Edward Lord Montague to go and purchase the car. So, Ken, would you like to come and tell the tale?
Thanks very much, Doug. Yes, it's an interesting story, and the role that car played in the subsequent success of Beaulieu and the creation of the National Motor Museum, I don't think has really been fully appreciated. Some of you can cast your mind back that far. I arrived at Beaulieu in 1969, and the British motor industry was contracting at that time. All sorts of famous names were disappearing. At that time, Lord Montagu decided to create what was then the Beaulieu Museum Trust. In order, his primary purpose was to give permanence to the collection. But there were other factors. One of those factors was that the vehicles had outgrown their previous home. You see a picture there of the Sunbeam outside the old school building that was the Montagu Motor Museum. When it was inside, it occupied one long wall. Everybody just went straight past it. You couldn't appreciate it. But it was owned by Roots Group. I have to say, and with no disrespect to Roots Group, like every other motor manufacturer, their heritage was a problem to them. They didn't know what to do with it. Nobody really wanted to look after their heritage. They didn't know how to show it, how to care for it, etc. And yet they were doing things like lending these vehicles to Beaulieu. Obviously, Lord Montagu then had made the Montagu Motor Museum exceptionally successful. Beaulieu was the most popular visitor attraction in the country at that time. 500,000 visitors a year. And the companies that owned these things that were loaned to Beaulieu began to think, well, we're loaning them there, and Lord Montagu's making money out of it, and that's a company asset. So on the one hand, they didn't want to look after their heritage, and on the other hand, they were worried that somebody else was making money out of it. But Lord Montagu was determined to create the Beaulieu Museum Trust, which he did. And when I arrived here in '69, shortly afterwards, we laid the first foundation stone. The original trustees were recruited. They were all the captains of the then motor industry, and their names are on the original foundation stone. But one name that isn't there is one that came to be extremely important, and that is Gilbert Hunt. Now, Gilbert Hunt he had worked for Massey Ferguson, and when the Roots Group was to be taken over by Chrysler recruited him to conduct this change from Roots Group to Chrysler. Originally, they said that they would just take a third of the equity in Roots Group, so it would stay British, but in time that became 2/3. So Gilbert Hunt came in as somebody who was not a captain of the motor industry at the time. He was not one of the big names around the table with the great cars that had been built in this country. But Gilbert was the due person. And Lord Montagu, who was incredibly well known amongst the leaders of the motor industry at that time, spoke to Gilbert Hunt and said, look, we would like you to help the museum. And then the question came up, well, our car's already there. Yes, but we'd like you to sponsor them. That became really complicated. The Americans didn't understand it. How could we can we give the car to Beaulieu? So they came up with a wheeze. They would give the money to Beaulieu to enable Beaulieu to buy the car at auction, provided the price of auction was affordable. So here I am, I've only been here for a year, and suddenly I'm told I've got to go to Measham to buy a car that had been sitting in the Motor Museum shortly before. So I went to Measham. Those of you who have ever been there were tiered seats, a tiered audience, a bit like this. And then there was an auctioneer here, and the cars would go across here, and he'd take bids from the people who were there. Now, my budget was £10,000. In the year we're talking about, that was worth about 125,000 in today's money. A lot of money. I was, frankly, the young lad, as I then was, standing there, and the car comes across, and I start bidding. And I can't understand what's going on. Every time I bid, the auctioneer looks at me and ups the price and takes another bid. So I have another go, and he does it again. And this began to really worry me because the price was getting closer and closer to my 10,000 limit. And eventually, much to my enormous relief, we got the car for £10,000. And afterwards, I discovered that the other bidder was directly behind me. And I couldn't see him. I had no idea there was another bidder. And what's the significance of this to the success that subsequently happened here with the creation of the National Motor Museum? Well, Gilbert Hunt, by this time, had become swiftly very important in the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. At the time that we bought the car, he was about to become vice president. He then became president, and then he was instrumental with Lord Montagu trying to see if we could get a member of the royal family to come and open the museum. which was in fact the Duke of Kent, that you can see sitting there on the right. And on the left, you'll see Gilbert Hunt, there in the front row. He wasn't one of the original trustees of Beaulieu, but because of the Sunbeam and this arrangement, he became the most important trustee at the time. Board were also important. You'll see Lane Crossland there over on the right. And then the sweetener, the Duke of Kent, was that this extraordinary model of the other Sunbeam would be made by the apprentices of Roots Group and presented as a sort of mark of the excellence of Roots Group to the Duke of Kent, and he has it as his own vehicle. So that's how we came to own, the National Motor Museum came to own the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam, an extraordinary car. But if it hadn't been for the car, hadn't been for Gilbert Hunt, showing the confidence in the museum at a time which was very difficult for the British motor industry, and you know the rest, it was incredibly successful. Lord Montagu engendered the support, the funds were raised, the museum was created, and you're all here tonight.
Someone who had the name Hill said, Graham Hill said, this isn't the first time today I've got up from a warm seat with a piece of paper in my hand. I move on. We have an awful lot of reference pictures, and we use reference. Now, you know me, walking up and down and talking. I'm going to follow my notes tonight, one hopes. And this car that you see is when it came out of the factory. And as you see it, it has, just before the numbers 1,000 horsepower, there are louvres there for cooling of the rear engine. And the spats, which the film went on to say about there was overheating problems, the reason the spats weren't used. And we have found, there's lots of evidence in our restoration, in the disassembly of the car, that we found to go on. We've even found job numbers on parts of the car. So this is the chassis on its side, which has been hugely useful for us. And indeed, if you were to lay that car the right way up now, that's pretty much as you'll see it tonight in the museum. But we have looked at the pictures and we have seen that there are spacer plates put in places where the engine and the gearbox are mounted. There are surfaces which have been machined and milled down flat. It's obviously had a fit up, it's obviously been put together once, and it's come apart again. Great reference picture for us. A lot of measurements we can take from the photo, and a lot of, oh, that's how it went together, so it's got to come apart this way. You know, that's what we... There's no handbook with this car, no Haynes manual. No one to say, here, Bert, how did you get the clutch out of one of them? So, as ever, this is a picture that most people have seen referring to this car. There's the transmission, which we took apart yesterday and this week on the left-hand side. Behind the transmission and the drive sprockets are the rear radiators. Circ have kindly got the radiators at the moment, and they are encountering problems. They're wondering, for example, well, they're saying we can't get honeycomb for the honeycomb radiator. So we're now thinking the cooling of the engines is most important factor. We might go for a filament radiator made out of aluminium because the skills to make them out of brass aren't right. We want the car to be right, but yet again, we want it to run cool. I'm very privileged to have been able to drive the V16 BRM, and when you're not driving it very fast and you've got 600 horsepower that wants to let go, the thing gets really hot really quickly. The 350 horsepower Sunbeam gets really hot really quickly, so it's one of the things we're going to do, and Ian will go to talk about that later. But can you tell me on that picture, here I go, I'm going for a walk now. Can you see on that picture what is the most important part? If we could visit that, apart from the guys that are screwing it together, what we would want from that picture? Any clues? Any ideas? Far right hand side, look, there's a table with all the drawings. There's our Haynes book. Sadly, the Luftwaffe didn't like Wolverhampton very much. Most of the Sunbeam drawings, etc., disappeared. And then another huge reference part for us is this picture, which again is a famous picture. But of course you wonder, car so prepared and so well thought about, why it would overheat. Well, the big pipes are cold water going into the engines. They could regulate the temperature with the flow of fresh water going through the engines. There has been all sorts of contradictions about the length of time that those engines run. There is definitely a minimum of 6 hours under full load. There's one document that says they ran for 20 hours under full load. However, there was all sorts of problems with the thing when they first started it. Now I'm going to refer here to a document that was, well, not a document, an article in the Motor, which was written by a guy called Irvine, J.S. Irvine, who actually designed it, so I think he might know what he's talking about. He went on to work on the Napier Irvine Special, aka Golden Arrow, so a bit of a clever blokey. There's a lovely picture, don't know if you can see it. Top right there is the Eiffel Tower and a little arc over it. At 200 miles an hour, he worked out that the car had enough kinetic energy with, I've forgotten what the angle is, with a ramp to jump over the Eiffel Tower and clear it by 50 foot. That's very useful. No, we're not going to try. Nor are we going to go fast with this car. When we first publicised that this car was going to be run, we were going to restore it, people were saying, well, how foolish, how hell are you going to do 200 miles an hour, you're going to wreck it, etc. No, we're not. The tyres, well, sense and serviceability is the biggest controlling factor, but the tyres won't allow us to go over 70 miles an hour. We can't get those tyres. Just to make the moulds of the tyres cost over £100,000. So we're running on a standard size tyre. Well, not very standard, but I would just like to read this little bit. The chains were observed after 50 seconds of running to be throwing vast amounts of sparks and were glowing red. We went on to see that this was because the chains started to sway under the enormous power and were running not true from side to side. So they went back to Coventry chains. They're not there anymore, sadly. And they redesigned the chains to run straight under the power. So if they'd taken that car without putting it on that test bed, it would have split the chains. Those chains, at full chat, under full power, on each pin of the chains, there's 4.5 tons of shear stress. 7 tons, sorry, of stress in the side links, splitting them apart. So they wouldn't last very long going red hot, that's for sure. And everything is exponential with the car, and of course we're not going to be running it anywhere near. But there is massive oil tanks for each chain, and there's a drip feed, the first Scott oiler, one might say, for us motorcyclists. On there, there's a drip feed lubrication to the chains. Oh yes, one last thing. Note the driver's seat. Driver's seat is pleated, and the seat we've got in the car now isn't. So we know that the upholstery in the car is not original. So we were very careful with the upholstery to start with. We still want to preserve what we've got, but it's interesting to find that that is not the seat that Miss Daytona sat in. You'll see her later. One of the important things with this car, here it is coming out of the factory, and one of the things we're really, really keen on, and we'll talk about the National Motor Museum, is about the social history which the car, how it affects the motor car, how it affects their lives, are the people that built the car. And this car has had a profound influence on the history of Wolverhampton. And people, Dr. Jon would say, people are coming up to us and say, my great-grandfather did the upholstery, my great-uncle did the bodywork, etc. And we're getting an awful lot of feedback from Wolverhampton and people who are involved in the building of this car. And we're hoping that people will come back to us and actually say, we've got some pictures that you haven't seen. Not yet, but... Sorry?
Wasn't there enough people to bump stone?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the one at the back that... Sit. How many times have I landed flat on my face when it fires and disappears from under you? Yeah. And there she is, Miss Daytona, sitting in the car. Bless. Yeah, don't she? Mind you. No, I'm not saying a word. However, look at the in front of her face. There's the wind deflector that you mentioned, thank you, in your piece. There's a wind deflector to stop Seagrave's flying helmet come off, or his helmet flying off, I should say. And there is this air scoop mounted on the side to replace the louvers because it's reported as saying that the rear engine overheated really quickly. And so after the initial run, modifications were made to the car. Here it is, we think, one of the first times on the sand, people all around it, and of course it's got a guy who's actually taken the air intake out, taken the louvers off. It's still got the rear spats on, and I'd like to think those are going in the bin as well. That's the time when they've said, well, this isn't going to work. Then we see it, obviously it's after it had a run, it's got sand stuck up under the front wheel arch. It's got ace rim embellishers on the back, the rear wheel discs. Now, they must have taken some of those parts with them because there they are, they screw on, it's quite a complicated thing to put those on. They must have had some time. Also, think about what you saw in the video. He drove it down the beach and the car, the brake shoes melted. Anyway, well within an hour, the car was turned round with fuel, fresh tyres, and went back. He didn't change the brake shoes. It wasn't the brake shoes that melted, it was the brake backings, the actual aluminium parts of the brake shoes. And so he drove it back even faster, 207 miles an hour, knowing that it wasn't going to stop. There you go. No wonder he's looking chuffed. I stopped it. And the Dunlop tyres. Guys who everybody knows Derek. Doesn't that look like Derek? Yeah? A motorcycle. We got volunteer Derek, a very quiet, unassuming guy who actually rode 350s around the Isle of Man back in the day. In the race, not just around the island. And this was a big thing for Dunlop, huge. One of the big marketing things, Dunlop, as in Castrol Wakefield, were a sponsor at the time, and people who took land speed records back then, as they did in your day, whatever, sponsorship, huge, huge thing, and a big, big marketing thing for Dunlop. And those special tyres, back then, were in tens of thousands of pounds each. They cost to develop. Now, this is a bit of film, and I want you to, very short, and I might have to play it twice, but I want you to pay close attention, particularly to the cockpit of the car. And there's no sound, all right, so right, let's see if I go back. There we go. All gone back twice, have I? Have another look at the cockpit. It's going two up. It's got a mechanic hanging on it. Now we've had a look, and he's got one foot on top of the gearbox and the other foot up against one of the exhaust stubs. And there's film, which I couldn't rob, taken from the aircraft that was supporting the event, and it actually follows it down the beach. You can clearly see the mechanic hanging onto it. And what had happened to it was it stuck in second gear. We saw another bit of film when we were abroad, didn't we, of it being driven away. And he's in there, as long as Seagrave, trying to get the thing out of second gear. And just the day before yesterday, we got the top of the gearbox off, and we found some chunks out of the lead edge of second gear. So obviously they had a good graunch with it. And it, do you want to see that again? I do. Here we go. You know, you watch it go past, you can see him, look. That's one of those, you're volunteering, aren't you? Probably the youngest of the people that went across, isn't it? The apprentice. And this is how the land speed record, look at the date and look at the speed and look what happened between 1923 through to 1930. Look how many records were taken. Look at how close the margins were. And this guy Campbell was everywhere. Yeah? And what an amazing leap that the Golden Arrow took, 30 miles an hour. The 350, the Sunbeams, you know, the 350 Sunbeam at 150.76, that holds 3 land speed records. The centenary is happening again next year. That took three records. The speed and how many people are trying and trying and trying, and it was being batted backwards and forwards between America and the UK, etc. And God bless the people who perished trying to do it as well. So that's a bit about the history of what we're up against, and we're finding so many reference points. So I'm going to pass you over to Ian Stanfield, who is, if anybody's got a V12 Sunbeam aero engine they want fixing up, here's your kiddie. I'd like to personally say thank you to you all coming. Thank you to our sponsors, people who put money towards it. I'm looking at some very kind gentlemen. Bob, one of our volunteers, has paid for the air start system. If it doesn't start, it's your fault, Bob. And people who've already put their hands in their pockets, because if it wasn't for the funding, we would not be able to put this wonderful car back together. And it's what an amazing piece, a piece of amazing British history. So thank you, and I'm going to pass you over to Stan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to now run through some images of the car as we've been working on it. But we'll go back to the 350 Sunbeam. In 2015, when we originally did that car, we learnt an awful lot from that particular engine. And we thought we'd better have a look at the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam, because we hadn't looked at it for years. So we decided to have a quick look, and that's what we found. So that's why we are doing this project. We couldn't leave it any longer. We needed to do something about it immediately. So in 2015, we took the engines out of the car. And then we spent the next 10 years pulling them apart, or certainly one engine apart. We've still got another engine to take apart. The rear engine that we've got in the air there, as is the front engine, is totally seized. We don't know when the engines last ran. We think round about 1939, but we're not sure. There's no documentation. So they've been sat still for a very, very long time, and they've had water in them at some point, and there's frost damage to the blocks, and there's all sorts of issues with them. So the first engine there took us 18 months to unseize. Very difficult job to do. So if you look at the top right picture there, that was the first thing we did. We turned the engine upside down. Bob and myself there took the crankshaft out of the engine because we couldn't turn the engine, and we needed to turn the engine to get a datum for timing the engine for the ignition timing and the valve timing. Couldn't turn it at all. So we took the crankshaft out, and then if you look at the left-hand picture at the top there, we started freeing off the pistons, because that's where it was seized. The pistons in the bores were seized. And if you look at the bottom right-hand picture there, that's what's called a master and slave rod. So you have the main rod with another rod articulating off the main rod. And you can't take them out of the engine when they're connected like that. So we had to free off each of the cylinders one at a time to get them to move up and down inside the cylinders, and then we could put the crankshaft back in and then turn the engine so that we could time it up. I'll come to the timing pictures in a minute. On the left hand side there, you'll see that's the inside of one of the cylinder blocks, and with the corrosion that had happened to the engine and the seized pistons, we'd found that there was cracks in the aluminium castings. There's a steel liner that runs up inside the aluminium, and corrosion had got between the two, and it had cracked the liner, the cylinder block. So we can see some laser welding, a new experience for us. We managed to get that laser welded back together. So there's not a lot of heat, so there's no distortion in anything. So it's and it worked very, very well. And you see the holes in the casing, the 4 vertical ones there. Well, Bob knows those very well, because on each of the blocks there's water jacket plates on the side of the blocks. I'll be able to show more of that when we get down and see the car. But there's 496 of those holes, all a little 2BA screw, and every one of them sheared off. So Bob was very good at drilling holes and making bolts. That kept him busy for months.
Kept him quiet too.
So, timing the engine. So, 22.4 litre, double overhead cam, 4 magnetos, and there's no marks on any of those gears. So you have to start at the very beginning, and the very beginning is the crankshaft right at the bottom. And most of the other gears don't really matter until you get to the top 2. And that's where the camshafts are, and that's where you get your valve timing. So once we were able to turn the engine to a top dead centre point on number 1 cylinder, then we were able to time the engine, and we marked all the gears, so we won't have the problem of timing it again. But as I said, that took us best part of 18 months, 2 years to get to that point. Bob again. I'm sorry, Bob. You just happen to have a lot of pictures of you, you know, so. The right-hand picture shows all the check valves. Now that's part of the air start mechanism. And there's a plaque on the engine that says this engine will not run because vital components have been removed. And the vital components are the air start mechanism. There's a check valve for each cylinder, and you can see the amount of parts that there are in the valve, and there's one bit missing, the spring isn't there as well. So we had to make 24 of those. And I'm shaking hands with Bob there because he paid for them. There's the plaque that says vital part missing. And it wasn't just the check valves, it was all the plumbing for the air start mechanism, and the distributors for the air start mechanism were missing as well. But if you look on the right hand side there, you'll see there's a little date on the crankcase there, 28th of the 1st, 1918. So that's when those engines were manufactured. The car took its record in 1927. So there were second-hand old engines And as Scarf and Goggles have said, those engines were used in a powerboat called Maple Leaf 7. 4 of those engines went to Detroit and were going to compete in the Harmsworth Trophy, but when they unloaded the boat, they managed to drop it, crack the hull, took it out, did some test runs with it, brought it back where it promptly sank at the mooring. So the boat was brought out, taken back to England, the engines were removed. They then kicked around the factory for a few years before the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam project came about. There's the pipework for the air distributor. You see the air distributor on the left and its component parts on the right. Now, we only had one casing of the air distributor and no internals, so we didn't know what the inside looked like. Again, there's no drawings for anything. But we were lucky enough to find another distributor up at the Rolls-Royce Heritage Museum up in Derby. So we've managed to borrow the distributor for them and copy it. And another one of our friends within the industry, a chap by the name of Alan Glue, he's a Rolls-Royce specialist. He restores Ghosts and Phantom Ones. He offered to do the distributors for us, so he's manufactured new distributors and rotors for us. So all we've got to do is work out how to time it up. So 5-minute job again. You know, so. But the plumbing, again, was all done by a local firm down in Poole, JT Pipes, I think it was. So we've got, they've been on the phone recently because they know about the project and they're quite willing to do the second engine for us as well. So this chap here, there's a lot of people here that know him. Terry Formals. Terry, we met long before we got to the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam project. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But when we got talking about the 350 horsepower, he got very, very enthusiastic. And he was running his business out of his back garden at that point. He had his own little shop down the end of the garden. And he's a specialist in engine rebuilding and especially white metal bearings. And he did the engine of the 350 for us for nothing. Wonderful chap. And then when we mentioned the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam, he got enthusiastic again. So there you can see the engine is in his workshop, which has now grown. He's now got 3 units in Downton. And the engine white metaling is being done there. You can see the crankshaft in there and all the line boring that's going on. And we've got lots of Formals people here tonight, so again, thank you very much. Thank you, Evie. And this is where we come to the museum. We've had the car all over the place this year, at the NEC, at Farnborough, at Goodwood, to raise its profile and you know, try and get as much sponsorship and help as we can. But now it's back in the museum, we're taking it apart because we need to get at all the major components. And you can see we're reverting back to those early pictures that Douglas was showing, back to the bare chassis, because we've got to take all the axles out, all the major components so that we can inspect them, crack test them, and make sure they're fit for purpose. Even things like the brake shoes have to be renewed, even though they've done about 10 miles. And while we were dismantling it, we managed to find a few hidden treasures. Top left there is one of the oil tanks. The oil used in this engine is called Castrol. A lot of people have heard of that. What wonderful Castrol. I hate it with a passion. It kills engines. And it turns to, it's a vegetable oil, so once it's got hot, it solidifies basically. So after every race, you're supposed to strip the engines, clean them and refresh the oil. But of course, it didn't happen with these engines. So the oil solidified. But while we were cleaning out the oil tank on the top there, we were having to put it in a big hot water tank and heat it up to 60 degrees with lots of detergent, and we were shaking it around, trying to get the oil out, and it started to rattle. So we wondered what the rattle was. Couldn't understand what it was, thought it was a baffle in the tank that had come loose. But eventually, after much shaking, on the right-hand side there, you'll find the first 200-mile-an-hour screwdriver. Or dipstick, depending on what you want to call it. So some poor engineer had been trying to see how much oil was in the tank and dropped it in there. And once it's in there, there's no way of getting it out. So it went for the run. And also, while stripping the car down, left-hand side there, 200-mile-an-hour adjustable spanner. And that was really glued to the chassis with the oil. You almost had to chisel it off. And on the far right there, while we were cleaning up the road springs, we found a shilling coin, dated 1921. So we're always finding things. So those are down in the museum. We'll have a look at those later. Right, now you see the job number on the right-hand bottom one there? Well, while we were soda blasting the chassis to get all the grime and dirt off it, that number was painted with silver hammerite paint. At some point in its history, people have been trying to tidy the car up, and they've painted all the springs silver and other bits red, and and lots of silver paint in the cockpit area. But we managed to uncover those, and that was all part of deciding what we were going to do as far as the restoration of the chassis was concerned. Shall we shot blast it and paint it? Trimite are giving us all the necessary painting materials to repaint the car. But we've decided not to take all the paint off because it will destroy all that history. So we're going to clean it up, and then we're going to clear coat it with a Trimite clear lacquer as well. So that will preserve all of that history. Now we've taken all the suspension off of it. That's the front axle coming out of it, the stub axles, the kingpins, and the whole axle is now off of the car, as is the road springs. So it's just a bare chassis at the front end now, as it is at the back. And those are all off because in a couple of months' time we're going to have a session of crack testing, so we can check all the major components, make sure there's no flaws in it. Even though it's only done a few miles, it's done a few hard miles, so we're going to make sure there's no damage to it at all. So strip, clean, repaint where necessary, lacquer where necessary, check all the springs, and then we'll start building it up again. And in March, I'm going to start putting the rear engine back together, so hopefully at some point this year, we'll have one of the engines running. Douglas was mentioning the chains earlier. There's the sprocket drive for it. You'll see that the rear drum there with the sprocket on it, there's no way you're going to change the brake shoes in an hour. So it took us about a week to get that far. So chains are a big issue at the moment because we can't get any chain of the right dimensions, so it looks like we're going to have it made. So, but we don't need to have it made to the same specification as the Run because it's not going to be doing 200 mile an hour. So my bit's done, so I'm going to hand over to Richard now. So thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. What a turnout. Isn't that fabulous? Thank you for coming. Yeah, I've been coming to this museum ever since I was about 9. I still remember when it was in the school, so God knows when that was. And I'm just so damn glad you're going to recover the car and get it running. We'd all like to know what it sounds like and what it goes like. And looking at the history is fascinating because about this time, I remember doing a study for Castrol, and the British industry, or the British market for cars, was growing at 300% per annum. And Castor was making, of course, a fortune filling all those sumps. Of course, they'd filled all the sumps too for all the World War II airplanes, World War I airplanes. And there was a huge interest in the cars, because now the cars were giving people an opportunity to travel, to see, giving them an opportunity to travel, exactly that. So in 1926, Frenchman Monsieur Louis Hervé Cotelin, I hope I got that right, had un grand problème, because Seagrave had driven the 4-litre Sunbeam to 152 miles an hour at Southport, and that must have been bloody dangerous. You look at the Southport track there. John Parry Thomas then raised the record to 171 miles an hour in the appalling Babs. And Malcolm Campbell, of course, had the most beautiful and the most incredibly expensive Bluebird being built, powered by the 450 horsepower Napier Lion. So Cotelin he'd got to compete. He'd got to be there. He'd got to do it. So he had a huge problem. He had virtually no money and less time. So the 1,000 mile an hour, 1,000, get that right, 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam would have to be built from Sunbeam pump spin and would need an awful lot of power, certainly twice as much as Campbell. So we're now going to run the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam again in 2027, 100 years later. It's going to be a brilliant experience. We're going to learn so much from all this. Already you've heard from Stan how much is being learned about the car and how it was built. And of course, I do hope that our American friends will respond. Maybe they could build a replica of the triplex, for instance. Let's have 2 of them out there. That'd be really something. The 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam is often described by the motoring journalists as a crude and desperate example of a land speed record car. They didn't realize, they didn't know. But looking back on the Sunbeam from today's perspective, we can see a lot of very valuable design input coming from that car, which we're all able to use. The land speed record is an absolutely brilliant institution, which dates back to 1898. There are effectively minimal rules. This is unlimited racing. Okay, there are minimal rules. 4 or more wheels, 2 passes over a measured mile or kilo, and effectively no other design restrictions. And because you see the technology with all these land speed record cars is experimental. It's experimental and way beyond the experience, of course, of the rule makers. So the objective is ultimate speed. This is in complete contrast to our friends at Formula One, where the idea is the closest possible racing to keep the crowds really excited. Really high speeds have to be discouraged in Formula One because the race circuits would have to be rebuilt at massive capital costs. So the whole idea is to try and keep the speeds down. By comparison, the land speed record operates largely on beaches and deserts, and the best sort of accommodation we have is porta cabins and trucks. Now, the power requirement is usually related to the cube of the speed. So if you're going to go twice as fast in the same car, you need 8 times the power. Except, of course, when you approach supersonic speed. That's when there's an enormous increase in wave drag, aerodynamic wave drag, and it requires an enormous power increase. Our ThrustSSC car of 1997 basically required 110,000 horsepower, which is nearly 1.6 times the motive power of the UK's largest aircraft carrier. And Bloodhound SSC, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, was designed for twice the power of HMS Prince of Wales. It's interesting relating cars to aircraft carriers. This puts the whole thing into perspective. Now, there's a critical point. Back in 1983, we got the mile land speed record at 633 miles an hour with my car, Thrust 2. Thrust 2 is about the same size as the Slug, weighs a little bit less, and has 35,000 horsepower. We made a mistake. We got a record increase. Well, we got to 633 miles an hour, peak speed of 650, of just 1%, was the 1.7%, after 6 hard years' work to actually get the car built and run. We had it wrong. Such a small increase is a strategic risk. We might not have made the record. I mean, there was such a small margin, we might just not have got there, or it might have been taken and put out of our reach while we were still building. So we got that wrong. So in future, we have to go for a much, much greater speed increase. With the ThrustSSC, the speed increase was 130 miles an hour or 20%. This means as a team, you've got to set your sights much, much higher